All right. Welcome to Barn 100 at Bennington College, one of our oldest classrooms, and quintessential kind of space, and very hot on a summer's day. Here we are in the summer of 2020, where everything has moved out of these rickety wooden seats and on to Zoom and these online videos. Such is the moment we live in, and such is the moment we're trying to sort of sort out and navigate our way through. My name is David Bond. I teach anthropology and environmental studies and help steer the Center for the Advancement of Public Action at Bennington College. So, in a typical class, we would start off with a kind of discussion around a big question that we would explore. And really, the big question that I've been asking myself as I've tried to sort of sit down and put together a few preliminary thoughts on COVID is how should we even go about understanding this pandemic? Where does one start in the midst of sort of history happening? It's clear that these are unprecedented times. It's clear that so much of what we once thought no longer holds. So where exactly should we begin? What kind of thing is COVID, and how should we sort of focus our attention upon it? And it's a big question, and I'll sort of maybe unpack it a little bit and what I'm sort of meaning by that before we jump into the formal sort of talk. So, I think there's probably two schools of thought about how to approach COVID-19 in a sort of more scholarly way, especially in the social sciences. And one is to sort of embed it in what we already know of social structures. And so if you want to understand COVID-19, see how it's playing out into things we already know a lot about. How does it play out within the histories of capitalism, the state, empire, inequality, and sort of pull it into that terrain that we already know, and see how its impact is sort of resonating or echoing within those histories and structures. Another school of thought, however, is sort of suggests this is profoundly new. There's something happening here that can't be reduced to things we already know. That COVID-19 is introducing a new sort of intensity and scale of instability in our world that has to be taken stock of on its own terms, not by reducing it to something we already know, but paying closer attention to the emergent qualities of both this pandemic and the emergent qualities this pandemic is infecting our world with. So there's two sort of ways of thinking. First, maybe we should place COVID-19 in histories of things we already know. Perhaps that's capitalism. We know the early spread of COVID-19 moved along the routes of the globalized economy. It moved from China with startling speed to New York, to Europe, and elsewhere along the heavily trafficked routes that sort of link our global economy. And today, in so many ways, our major cities, New York City, San Francisco, are almost more connected to China than they are to cities in the middle of the US. Indeed, there are more non-stop flights from New York City to Wuhan than there are non-stop flights to Wichita today, or there were before everything shut down. And so much of our world is sort of linked by these sort of centers of capital and finance. And you can see the ways that this virus sort of followed that geography as it spread out. So perhaps the history of capitalism is the sort of thing we should turn to. We might also say, no, it's the history of state power. And you can see sort of how state power, particularly the recent sort of lurch to the far right, in places like Brazil, India, Hungary, and the US, have brought sort of a deep distrust of institutions of science and democracy into the houses of power. And this has been a recipe for amplifying the injury and harm something like COVID-19. So perhaps if we want to understand what this thing is, COVID-19, we need to embed it in recent histories of state power and ideologies from the right of sort of dismantling institutions of democracy and science. Perhaps that's the way to go. Or perhaps there's something about the virus itself that we should attend to. Not necessarily pulling it into histories we already know in some way, but trying to take stock of what's emergent and what's new about this pandemic. What are its new properties that it's introducing into our world? So how should we try to understand this thing? How should we approach this pandemic moment? Whether by pulling it into things we already know about, or trying to sort of take stock of what it's introducing into our world.
Okay, so those are some broad introductory themes. And were this a typical class, we'd now sort of break up into groups to start discussing some of these questions. What kind of thing is COVID-19? Is COVID-19 primarily a social problem? Or is COVID-19 primarily a biological phenomenon? Should we understand COVID-19 by first embedding it within the histories, structures, and relations that define our present? Or should we understand COVID-19 by first grasping the profoundly new viral properties and medical injuries it has introduced into our world? Obviously, we need both questions. We have to understand both aspects of this pandemic. But how? How can we bring these two lines of inquiry, these two dimensions of COVID-19 together? It's a tricky question, in part because these questions move in such fundamentally different directions. Indeed, the sciences themselves were formed in no small part by first dividing these realms, the social and the natural, as two wholly opposed and completely different realms. So much of what now counts as science, whether in the academic locations of science or in the departmentalization of how we inquire into the world, or even in the public life of expertise itself, is premised on either the social world or the natural world being understood in complete isolation from the other. Today, such divides are not only out of date, they actually impede the ways of knowing and orientations of action we now so desperately need. While climate change has long been making this point from the slow contortions of atmospheric systems and modeled futures of catastrophe, COVID-19 has brought the impossibilities of such disciplinary divides into startlingly clear focus. Against such divorced ways of knowing the world, I'm interested in how the social and natural sciences might come together in critical new collaborations around the question of how COVID-19 is bringing us together in new ways and how it is tearing us apart in old ways. It is to this theme that we now turn.
What did Lenin once say? Some decades nothing happens at all, and then comes along a decade when everything happens at once. Who needs a decade when you have 2020? What a whirlwind the past few months have been. What a whirlwind the past few days have been. For the first time in my lifetime, it feels truly like everything is up for grabs. Once solid ground has turned to mush, and the tidal force of change keeps rising on all sides. It's impossibly bleak some days. Never has the profound inadequacy and wholesale complicity of the status quo been so apparent. Never has the necessity of radical transformation been clear. Never has political possibility been fractured into so many tiny pieces, all waiting to die alone. While we're here to discuss COVID-19, this moment seems so incredibly crisscrossed with crisis that it's hard to pull one from the other. Obscene profiteering and deepening ecological collapse. Local shutdowns and global disunion. Institutions better equipped for past problems. Growing investments in not knowing. Proliferating despair, and fascist promises to restore order. And now outrage over racial injustice boils over in the streets. It's hard to make sense of a world that won't stay still in normal times. And these are so far past normality to make the question, the very question of normality fall out of fashion. Ours, I think, is fast becoming an age of upheaval. And it's hard for me to sort out what part of this upheaval is strictly the result of COVID, and what parts must be understood in concert with wider histories. What parts of this crisis are due to the insurgent contagion, and what parts are due to vulnerabilities long carved into people and places. What parts of this upheaval are attributable to the emerging properties of the virus, and what parts come from the dismal state of the world. We live in an age of upheaval, yet is coronavirus the underlying cause or the superficial provocation? The detonation itself or merely the fuse? The meteor or the metaphor? These are some early reflections, unfinished and unpolished, that gesture out in the directions of my own thinking. The questions that guide my inquiry remain resolutely unanswered. But then again, there's so much work to be done. I thought I'd talk over some of the things I've been reading and sort of thinking about as I've tried to pull together my own thoughts on this question of what moment we're living in. One of the first books I turned to was Carl Zimmer's A Planet of Viruses, an excellent sort of science book about what exactly a virus is. Viruses are very strange things, somewhere between our definition of living and dead. And it's a great sort of history of how viruses became intelligible and understood, and the science of viruses and how it shaped how we understand pandemics today. There's also a great history, Aubrey Crosby, on the influenza, the Spanish flu of 1918, America's forgotten pandemic. And Crosby makes this fantastic point that the real precedent for today is the Spanish flu of 1918. And Crosby makes this point that nothing like this had ever happened, and it was almost immediately forgotten. And he raises great questions of how we might think about the tragedy unfolding in our midst today, and what we might do about it. Also, William McNeill, an environmental historian, who has a great sort of book called Plagues and People. Most of our histories haven't included bacteria and viruses. They've included kings and soldiers and the descent of people who've had it. It's been human-centric histories that have shaped how we've come to understand our world. William McNeill is part of a growing class of scholars who've tried to bring in more biological agents as participants in our history. And this book, Plagues and People, offers a great overview of how we might include plagues in the telling of history. Also a book by Paul Farmer that I'm looking at, Infections and Inequality. Paul Farmer is a medical anthropologist, and he looks at how diseases never unfold on flat surfaces. They always infect unequal societies, and in so many ways they come to amplify existing inequalities of society. And so it does us no good to really try to separate the biological portions of this from the social portions. And Paul Farmer is one of those who's really trying to help us pull them together into a single kind of frame. Mike Davis, The Monster at the Door, does a quick history of the threat of the avian flu in our immediate moment. Davis is looking at how close we've come to a pandemic previously. This book was published a few years ago, but it makes the very clear point that none of this should have come as a surprise. There was tremendous reason to be on the lookout for new viruses like COVID-19, and indeed there was a number of investments over the past decade to try to prepare for something like this, many of which were starting to sort of be defunded of late. Mike gives an excellent job telling that story, and also showing how pharmaceutical companies became hugely disinterested in vaccines and spent tremendous amount of their resources and time trying to develop drugs that were more profitable than vaccines, which has left us at a tremendous disadvantage right now in the rush to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. The last book that I've been turning to try to make sense of this moment is Sebald's On the Natural History of Destruction, an excellent, more literary kind of essay that looks over the tremendous amount of destruction that happened in Germany in World War II. The whole cities were just destroyed, flattened, gone. And the strange way that people lived that tragedy, but never found ways of representing it publicly, never found ways of holding it in their consciousness in a more kind of public way. And so the strange way that everybody experienced total destruction, and yet total destruction never kind of enters the kind of ledger of history in literature and sort of more scholarly genres. And it's a sort of a strange book that's been really salient and resonant with me. So, COVID-19 has introduced a new pathogen into our world. A virus that once adopted to replicating itself within human cells spread with alarming veracity into every corner of our inhabited planet. It only took a matter of weeks to go fully planetary, showing just how interconnected our lives now are, and how equally vulnerable we all are. Humans, as a species, have no biological nor technological defenses against COVID-19. All we can try to do is hide from it. And it is more than a bit disconcerting to watch powerful nations and corporations, used to bending the world to their will, suddenly revert to ancient advice: shut down everything and shelter in place. As of today, COVID has infected nearly 10 million people worldwide and killed 500,000, while maiming many, many more. More now have died at the hands of COVID-19 than in any outbreak of war or natural disaster in the past 75 years. And in the most optimistic projections, we are only 1/3 of the way through this pandemic. Only 1/3 of the way through, in the best case. And here in the US, many are now intent on reopening as if everything is over and done with. The vast majority of this harm has unfolded in the past 3 months, and at the level of the human species at a planetary scale, continues to rise unabated. Yet even these catastrophic figures barely scratch the surface of what this virus is capable of. And now that COVID-19 has made itself at home in every language, in every nation, and every race, we wait for what comes next. COVID-19 has become a species-level event, a universal experience, something we all share on the planet today, a reference point for everyone. That is truly something remarkable. Although I struggle to venture a guess as to where that precarious and precocious commonality might go, what might take root in its recognition, or what might hijack its promise. So there's the commonality, all the things that we share around COVID-19. Yet something else is at work as well. even as it has given new definition to our shared humanity, both as a biological species and as a coherent set of shared historical experiences, COVID also divides us. The pandemic erodes the foundations of regional and global collaboration, distributes suffering in grossly unequal ways, and reveals long-standing structures of brutal inequity. Global institutions and agreements that prepared the global response for a pandemic. I mean, there were plans in place, agreements in place to deal with a pandemic, and institutions that were designed in some way and chartered to respond to just such a thing. All of which seemed to fall apart upon the first whiff of COVID-19. As every nation moved to shut itself off from the rest of humanity. The World Health Organization has lost 16% of its funding in the middle of a pandemic as the US withdrew support. Celebrated agreements in the EU to share healthcare resources during a disaster fell apart almost instantly. As hotels were overrun in Italy and Spain, their pleas for assistance were ignored, despite agreements in place that all of the EU would share health resources during a disaster. As the world withdrew into private quarters, many were left to fend for themselves. Refugee camps, day laborers, and slums found themselves adrift from the threadbare welfare and work that underwrote their daily survival. Surely the world's poor will bear the brunt of this contagion, and surely so much of their suffering will unfold just out of view. Elsewhere, jobs widely disdained as beneath most found themselves reclassified as essential, forcing a class of low-wage workers to nursing homes, grocery stores, and even slaughterhouses to continue working, in coercive ways continue working, despite the absence of protective gear or compensation equal to their newfound importance. In the US, 1 in 5 workers has been laid off thus far, a great many of them working-class jobs held by people of color. Those jobs show little sign of return, and unemployment benefits will start running dry in a few weeks, as will pauses in evictions. What happens then? In India, approximately 100 million people, a decent-sized nation, 100 million people, have found themselves stranded far from home as the informal economy ground to a halt. In Africa, some estimate that 50% of the jobs on the continent will disappear and perhaps never come back with COVID-19. The UN World Food Programme projects rampant unemployment that could have a catastrophic impact on the planet this winter when collapsing food systems intersect with impoverished desperation. The worst-case scenario finds starvation expanding its reach to nearly 300 million people. The virus itself inflicts harm in very particular ways, and we've seen how it gathers its harm along the lines of age and generation. In the US, the medical complications and fatalities are often distributed upward in age. The older folks suffer more of the medical complications. Yet, the economic fallout is distributed downward. Young adults are losing paychecks and economic opportunities in droves. One poll found that half of the Americans under the age of 45, half of Americans under the age of 45, had lost their job or had their pay cut back significantly in the past 3 months. According to that study, generation, your age, more than race, gender, or educational attainment, dictated economic vulnerability under COVID. Generation is coming to matter more as a kind of marker of inequality in this pandemic. Present location matters too. We've seen the virus starting in a number of major cities, although now it seems to be moving beyond just major urban areas. In the US, nearly half of the deaths have been traced to cramped life in institutional settings. Nearly half of all the deaths that have happened in the US due to COVID have happened in institutional settings. That is, 40% of the fatalities have occurred among long-term residents of nursing homes, prisons, and slaughterhouses, workers in slaughterhouses. The largest clusters of infection thus far have been in correctional settings. In some ways, warehoused lives provide an ideal social ecology for COVID-19. And our geography of disregard, those lives that we've deemed unworthy or insignificant, our geography of disregard seems to now map the front lines of this pandemic. Nor are all nations impacted equally. The US now leads the way on measures of the very worst outcomes. The US, supposed to be the most prosperous nation on earth, spends more on healthcare and on military than any other nation. By every measure, is at the very bottom of the heap in how it's dealing with COVID-19. With 4% of the population, the US now accounts for 25% of all COVID deaths. 1 in 4 deaths worldwide happens in the US. And it's getting worse. Has COVID shown the empire to be naked? Like all diseases, COVID does not flow over a flat surface. It infects deeply unequal societies, flowing across the cracks and fissures of our broken world and widening the gaps that divide. COVID gathers in the low points of vulnerability in our world. While we may all be in this moment together, we are not all in it in the same way. And many of the differences that we have are not only revealed by COVID-19, they're being inflated, amplified, exaggerated by this pandemic. So, as I've tried to sort of sketch out, there are sort of 2 dynamics at work in COVID-19 that I see. One, COVID-19 is sort of drawing us together in profoundly new ways. It's making the question of what is a human, as a species and a set of historical experiences, it's making that abundantly present and prominent in our world, the question of shared humanity. And at the same time, COVID-19 is dividing us in profoundly new ways. It's pulling us together and it's pulling us apart at the same time. This tension between the binding and cleaving forces of COVID, what comes together and what falls apart, are the core contradictions animating our political present, in my mind. This pulling together and this pulling apart at the same time is the defining contradiction, I think, of this moment. COVID-19 is voicing a clear definition of our shared humanity, and not strictly in biological terms. We are living a world historical event, a discrete problem now shared in one way or another by every single person living on the planet. We're all living a world historical event right now. We're all citizens of COVID-19 in some way. But what rights and what responsibilities will we now demand or defer? At the same time, COVID is widening the differences between those gated communities stocked to weather the storm and those masses sliding downward with safeguards quickly being dismantled. We are both drawn together as a common humanity and fractured into tiny little pieces. These contradictions open our world to radically new political possibilities. Whether to seize a justice over and above jurisdiction, to seize a justice beyond jurisdiction, or to inscribe control over and above citizenship. Whether to reconfigure the immense technical capacity of our world away from the accruals of power and profit and towards the universal delivery of dignity, or to see the emerging fault lines of injury as fine grounds to build new militarized borders and new camps of disregard, under the promise of securing the chosen race as the basis of securing the future. This is the core dynamic that I'm thinking about, and the core contradiction of the moment, is the way that this COVID-19 is sort of pulling us together around some notion of a common humanity, of a species-level event that's happening beyond mere biology, but actually in the ways that we understand ourselves as humans together, and has a kind of a new terrain of humanity, within which any number of projects might take root. They haven't yet, but they might. And it seems fertile ground for just such projects. At the same time, the world is sort of shot through with new fractures and fissures, as so much of the impact of COVID-19 happens in grossly, obscenely unequal ways. And so you see the impacts pulling us apart, and at the same time, the pandemic poses new questions of the human species. This, I think, is sort of laying the ground of our political moment, and sort of the defining kind of contradiction that we're in, that's sort of awaiting some resolution, and we'll see which way that goes. It also strikes me, and this is sort of moving on to sort of a couple tangents, it also strikes me that so much of this, the shared dimensions and rising divides of this moment, the shared dimensions and the rising divides of this moment, seem to unfold in a realm just out of reach from our daily lives. COVID-19 has already inflicted such profound loss that surely must touch every one of us in some way, whether we know it or not. The scale of this loss seems wholly without precedent in our lifetime. Truly, we've never seen something like this in our lifetime. What else would even come close? You have to reach back a century to the Spanish flu and World War II to find something even close. Surely we're experiencing a profound loss. Yet so much of that loss exists on the abstract plane of numbers, graphs, and projections. The existential tragedy of what's unfolding remains, somehow, just outside our collective register of the moment. Why? I don't know, but I'm sort of here's how I'm sort of thinking it out. The definitive understanding of the pandemic has largely advanced in quantitative terms, not qualitative ones. This is curious to me, as historically, quite often it was the qualitative dimensions of a new problem, the local stories, the people you knew, the disasters that hit close to home, that provided the first draft of history, that provided the first sort of reckoning and registering of profound upheavals and change. The macro quantitative analysis came later, after the fact. After things had settled, they could be measured properly. So in most of our history, the qualitative understandings of a new problem came first. And it's only after the fact of that problem that quantitative analysis comes to stand in and sort of definitively define how big, how bad it all was. I'm struck today by how that seems a little bit reversed, that in so many of the registers, the quantitative are leading our understanding of it, and the qualitative has sort of drifted to the edges. Today, a statistical portrayal of the pandemic commands the headlines as profiles in suffering move to the back pages of our news, if they're included at all. And the lived landscape of this pandemic, how we experience it, becomes more the stuff of Excel sheets than ethnography, more the stuff of linear graphs than literature, more the stuff of epistemological models than of magazine profiles, more the stuff of policy reports than of popular sovereignty. Perhaps this has something to do with the collapse of local journalism. Perhaps this has something to do with how we've learned to inhabit the present. It certainly has something to do with advances in computing, standardized data, and web accessibility. But what vision of what is shared in this moment and what divides us comes into focus if you only see the statistical shape of the pandemic. So around this question of the commons that we share in this pandemic and the pulling apart, in that contradiction of what's held in common and what's pulled apart. What comes into focus when we foreground the quantitative over the qualitative around that question? One tangent I've been sort of thinking of. Another tangent is the status of social science today. These preliminary reflections on COVID also carry a warning for the social sciences. The existing disciplinary structure and methodological norms of the social sciences seem insufficient to the present. The social sciences we've inherited no longer seems enough. Not least of all because the overwhelming presumption within the social sciences is one of an underlying order towards which social research aspires to lay hold of. A kind of bedrock stability upon which everything else rests. For so much of the social sciences, they've aspired to sort of touch that bedrock stability that can then explain everything on top. As becomes clear each day, we live in an age of upheaval, and those promising order increasingly appear on the other side of the aisle. History, as Karl Polanyi once wrote here at Bennington College during World War II, is once more in the gears of social change. History once more is in the gears of social change. What do I mean? In philosophy and in its practice, so much of social science is oriented towards explaining how we got here. Surely this remains a crucial task. But it's also becoming clear that our world is breaking from the past. Our present is departing the station. In so many ways, the forms of our present, the world we live in, its affective anchor points, its categorical certainties, and its institutional coherence no longer hold our experience. They no longer make sense of what we're living. These forms that we inherited seem inadequate to the task of taming instability, if taming this instability is even a possibility anymore. And what kind of social science might now be needed, not only to face up to this instability, but to begin to find ways of navigating it in a more equitable way? As you might gather, I believe social science can no longer sit comfortably on the sidelines. A social science that contents itself with mere interpretation is not enough. We need research that can intervene and not only diagnose this present sickness, but also chart out the foundations of a more equitable society. The time is now. More than ever, I think the time is now. Thank you so much.